The voice from the ship echoed like a ghost, its words slicing through the tense silence. Creel's fingers hovered over the console, unsure whether to respond or press forward. The voice, mechanical yet familiar, lingered in his thoughts. "Tourist photos," he muttered under his breath, disbelief thick in his words. "What kind of ship is this?" His pulse quickened, his mind working in overdrive. The alien warship, stationary and silent for centuries, had just spoken. It wasn't supposed to. Not unless it was waiting for something. And he was now part of it. "Commander!" Quinn's voice, steady as ever, pulled him from his thoughts. "This changes everything. We were never briefed on this type of encounter." His words seemed calm, but Creel could hear the edge of hesitation beneath the surface. Quinn's usual confidence was faltering, and it wasn't a feeling Creel liked. They had come here expecting answers, not cryptic riddles from the depths of space. But now they had one. And that one moment, that voice, shifted everything. Creel's mind raced as he leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the alien craft's docking port. Its design was unlike anything humanity had encountered. Jagged edges, sharp contours, the architecture of a long-dead civilization. Even with all the technology and sensors at his disposal, Creel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, analyzed from within the very bowels of the ship. It was a sensation that clung to him like the stale air in the cockpit, thick with the heavy scent of recycled oxygen, sharp and metallic. "Do you think this is a trap?" Quinn asked, his voice low. His words hung between them, thick with unease. Creel shot him a glance, the edge of his jaw tight. He didn't have time to entertain second guesses. Not now. "No," Creel replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's not a trap. They're waiting for us." He felt the heat of Quinn's stare, but no more words passed between them. The tension in the air felt like the calm before a storm, a suffocating quiet that pressed against their chests. The ship groaned beneath them, a soft, unsettling sound that seemed to grow louder as the distance between them and the alien vessel shrank. Each vibration echoed in the soles of Creel's boots as though the ship itself were alive, breathing in time with their own rhythms. Approaching docking port, Quinn's voice was tight, measured. His fingers moved across his own console, checking the systems again, double-checking the trajectory. There was no room for error. Not now. Creel's eyes didn't leave the viewport as the warship loomed closer, its surface now covered in scars, like a beast that had been through battle after battle. A dim light flickered across its hull, faint and dying, but enough to illuminate the gaps, the fissures, and the weapon systems that appeared dormant. He swallowed, the back of his throat dry, and prepared to make the final approach. The unfamiliar sensation returned, prickling his skin, a creeping cold that ran through his veins. They were not alone out here. The sensation wasn't just in his head. It was real. Something was waiting for them. He just didn't know what it was yet. "Ready to dock," Quinn's voice snapped him back. His words were sharp, decisive, but Creel could hear the uncertainty beneath the confidence. The ship felt alive in the worst possible way, like something was about to wake up, something ancient, something dangerous. "Brace for impact," Creel said, his tone steady but his grip tightening on the armrest. The sound of metal meeting metal echoed through the hull as the docking sequence began, and the ship, that silent relic, accepted them without protest. The docking clamps engaged with a low, metallic thud, their cold embrace sealing the human vessel to the alien warship with finality. The sensation was almost unsettling, like a door closing on a long-forgotten past. Creel stood, the stiff press of his uniform against his chest, his breath shallow in the dense, stale air of the cockpit. The faint aroma of synthetic atmosphere mixed with the metallic taste in his mouth, a reminder that they were about to step into the unknown. The ship's systems quieted, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of Creel's heartbeat to fill the space. "Captain," Quinn's voice broke the silence, rough with tension. "I don't like this. There's something off about this ship. It's not just abandoned." The words hung in the air, heavy and unnerving, but Creel didn't respond immediately. His focus remained fixed on the black viewport ahead, where the docking airlock waited. The doors slid open with a hiss, and an overwhelming sense of weightlessness hit them. A thick, suffocating stillness enveloped the pair as they stepped from the warmth of their ship into the void of the alien vessel. Creel felt his boots pressed down into the cold metal floor, the echoes of each step reverberating through the empty halls. He could almost taste the dust in the air, ancient, untouched by time, yet somehow still vibrant with the energy of something alive. The walls around them were smooth but weathered, their surfaces scarred with age. A cold light flickered overhead, the illumination casting long shadows that twisted and warped across the corridors. The shadows stretched like the fingers of forgotten gods, reaching for something they couldn't touch. The eerie silence was thick, oppressive, and it felt as though the walls themselves were watching them, waiting. The faintest echo of what might have once been a pulse beat somewhere deep inside the ship, now only the memory of life, a forgotten rhythm. "Stay sharp," Creel muttered, his voice low and deliberate. The words didn't seem to have any weight. Even his own breath sounded too loud. Quinn's footsteps were quieter, softer, a shadow to his side. They moved cautiously, as if the very ship might decide to wake up and swallow them whole at any moment. The longer they lingered in the silence, the more the air seemed to press down, dense and suffocating. As they rounded a corner, a cold draft swept over Creel's face like the exhale of something long buried. His eyes darted to the ceiling, searching for any sign of movement, but found none. Just the flickering lights and the oppressive weight of nothingness. "Do you hear that?" Quinn's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried with it an urgency that made Creel freeze in place. His ears strained, but the air seemed to hold its breath. For a moment there was only the sound of their own heartbeats. Then, from deep within the ship, a low mechanical groan echoed through the corridor. It was as if the warship itself was stirring, a reluctant giant waking from centuries of sleep. Creel's hand instinctively went to the sidearm holstered at his waist, but there was no need. The ship's voice filled the space once more. "Oh, this is rich," it said, the artificial resonance cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Another organic thinking they can take me for a spin. What a delight. Shall we begin the tour, or are you here to destroy what's left of my dignity first?" Creel's throat went dry as the words settled into the cold, sterile air. The voice was taunting, mocking, and yet it carried a note of something deeper, older, an ancient intelligence that had been lost to time. He exchanged a quick glance with Quinn, whose eyes were wide, unease rippling across his face. "We're not here to destroy anything," Creel said, his voice hard, steady. "We're here to understand what happened to you." A pause, a long, drawn-out silence. Then the voice spoke again, its tone shifting, almost sorrowful. "Understand, you say? How charming. But some things are better left forgotten." Creel's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary ship. This was something much more than just an ancient relic, and they were about to find out what. The voice of the alien ship lingered in the air like a thick fog, its mocking tone still hanging in the corners of the metal corridor. Creel's grip tightened on the sidearm at his waist, fingers trembling for the first time since stepping aboard the strange vessel. His mind raced as he glanced at Quinn, whose eyes flickered nervously, betraying the unease both of them were trying to suppress. The silence that followed the ship's words felt like an eternity, thick with the weight of an unspoken threat. They had crossed a threshold, not just into a forgotten corner of space, but into something far more complicated, something alive. Creel stepped forward, boots echoing louder than usual in the stillness, the metallic clank reverberating down the empty hallways. Every step seemed to stir something in the air, something unseen, as if the ship itself was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. A sharp, acrid tang filled the back of his throat, mixing with the stale air, but he swallowed it down. The ship was colder than it should have been, and even the dim, flickering lights above them seemed to hesitate, as though unsure of what was coming next. "Why don't you tell us what happened here?" Creel asked, his voice firm but edged with frustration. The silence stretched again before the ship responded, its tone this time more subdued, but no less unsettling. "What happened here?" The voice seemed to chuckle, as though amused by the question. "I suppose you could call it a tragedy, a war, betrayal, and a foolish decision that sealed our fates." It trailed off, the pause thick with meaning. Creel's stomach tightened. "A war? Who were you fighting?" Another pause. A low groan emanated from deep within the ship, and Creel could almost feel the vibrations in his chest. The walls around him seemed to shift subtly, creaking in protest, as though the ship itself was unwilling to divulge any more. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker lay beneath the surface, something buried under layers of silence and rust. The ship wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted by its past. "You think you know war," the voice resumed, slower now. "But you know nothing of the battles we fought, nothing of the blood spilled in the name of survival. We were forced to fight against the very ones we sought to protect. And then came the decision to shut us down, all of us." Creel's mind raced, trying to piece together the cryptic fragments of the ship's story. His eyes darted to Quinn again, who stood just a step behind him, his face pale as he scanned the surroundings. It was clear they were in, over their heads, but Creel's gut told him there was more. There was a key here, hidden somewhere within the ship's dark history, and he needed it. "We need to move," Creel muttered, his voice quiet but intense. The words seemed to break the spell that had settled over them, and Quinn nodded sharply. Together they moved deeper into the ship, the walls narrowing as the corridor stretched ahead. The air grew colder, a biting chill that sank into their bones, each step taking them further into the heart of something ancient. The walls felt like they were closing in on them, their once glossy surfaces now cracked and peeling, revealing the rusted skeleton beneath. The cold seeping into their skin was a reminder that this ship had been drifting in the abyss for longer than they could fathom. But it was not lifeless. No, something still lingered here. The lights flickered again, casting long, angular shadows that twisted unnaturally. It was as though the ship was playing with them, guiding them towards something they couldn't yet understand. The quiet was unbearable now, each breath louder than the last. And then, a voice, not the ship's, whispered through the stillness, so faint that it could have been a trick of the mind. "Turn back," it said, just loud enough for Creel to hear. His heart skipped, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. What the hell was that? Quinn's voice was raw with fear, but Creel silenced him with a glance. "Keep moving," he said, though even he wasn't sure what they were walking toward. But whatever it was, it would decide their fate. Creel's boots scraped against the cold metal floor as he and Quinn moved deeper into the warship's belly. The corridor was even more oppressive now, the dim lights casting sickly yellow shadows that twisted with every step they took. A distant low growl vibrated through the ship's bones, the sound echoing like a beast waking from a long, uncomfortable slumber. The walls seemed to narrow as they advanced, the silence around them thickening, suffocating. Creel's skin crawled, a prickling sensation creeping down his spine as though unseen eyes were following them. It was impossible to ignore the feeling of being watched, a weight on his chest that only grew heavier with each step. The air tasted stale, damp and musty, the bitter tang of old metal mixing with the faint remnants of something far older. It reminded him of forgotten catacombs, of places untouched by time yet unable to escape the decay of it. He inhaled deeply, the cool breath doing nothing to clear his senses. There was something more in the air, something thick and layered. He couldn't place it, an energy maybe, or a memory that clung to the walls like dust. It felt wrong, as if the ship were alive in ways it shouldn't be, carrying secrets buried far too deep for anyone to unearth. "You're telling me this ship was just left here, abandoned?" Quinn's voice was tight with disbelief, but Creel could hear the undercurrent of unease. The ship was unsettling, even for a seasoned officer like Quinn, and Creel couldn't blame him. The farther they went, the more the sense of wrongness tightened like a noose around them. "I don't know," Creel muttered, "but it's not just abandoned. Something happened here, something they don't want us to find." The whisper of his own words hung in the air, disappearing into the silence that followed. They turned a corner and found themselves facing another hallway, this one wider but no less ominous. The temperature had dropped, and Creel could almost see the frost on the walls, the edges of the metal turning dull under the strange light. It was colder now, cold enough to bite through his uniform, cold enough to steal the warmth from his body and his thoughts. Ahead of them, the door to a large chamber stood slightly ajar, the faintest crack of light spilling into the hallway. The strange growl from earlier had grown louder, almost rhythmic, like the beating of a heart, slow and deliberate. Creel's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his feet kept moving, as if guided by an invisible force. Quinn was at his shoulder now, his presence a solid anchor in the thickening tension. "Are we really doing this?" Quinn asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, the words fragile in the heavy air. Creel didn't answer at first. His eyes were locked on the door ahead, his breath shallow as his hand hovered near his sidearm. "We have to. Whatever this is, it's not just a wreck. It's alive in a way that doesn't make sense." They stepped into the chamber, the door sliding open with an unsettling hiss. The room stretched out before them, vast, metallic, and cold. The walls were lined with strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie, greenish glow, faint but undeniable. And in the center of the room, surrounded by what seemed like an intricate control panel, was a massive, open pod. Inside it, suspended in some strange fluid, was a figure, a humanoid shape, but its features were alien, distorted by centuries of stasis. The growl was louder now, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the ship, it was coming from the pod. Creel's heart raced as the figure's eyes flickered open. A pulse, faint but undeniable, thrummed in the air, vibrating through his very bones. Quinn stiffened beside him, his hand going to his weapon. But Creel didn't move. The mystery was no longer just about a forgotten ship. It was about this thing in the pod and what it meant for them. This is no accident," Creel said, his voice trembling for the first time. "Whatever is in that pod, it's the key." The figure in the pod stirred, a slow, unnatural movement, and the air around Creel grew thick with an unsettling vibration. The greenish glow from the symbols on the walls pulsed faster now, as if responding to the awakening of the being suspended in the fluid. The cold in the room deepened, creeping through the soles of Creel's boots, gnawing at his bones. A dull ache spread through his chest, an instinctive response to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The staleness of the air felt like a suffocating hand around his throat. Quinn stepped forward, but his footfalls seemed muted against the floor, as if the ship itself had swallowed the sound. Creel's breath caught as he watched the figure's eyes slowly flicker open, revealing a sliver of something dark beneath the translucent membrane. A flash of intelligence, a promise of something beyond their understanding. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The alien skin shimmered, an eerie, iridescent quality, as though its body was made of liquid light. "Captain," Quinn's voice was tight, barely above a whisper, but it still echoed in the vast, hollow chamber. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Creel said, his own voice betraying him, rough and uncertain. His fingers twitched at his sidearm, but there was a strange magnetism in the air, a pull to the figure that he couldn't resist. He should have stepped back. They both should have, but instead, they were drawn forward, hypnotized by the creature's awakening. A thin silver thread of liquid dripped from its eyes, pooling onto the floor with a soft splatter, like something both foreign and familiar. The room shifted, the shadows deepened, warping and twisting around them, the walls seeming to close in, the edges of the symbols flickering. There was a moment of silence, a quiet lull that seemed to hang in the air like a breath held too long. The growl from earlier, that rhythmic pulse, had grown louder now, and it wasn't just the sound that vibrated through Creel's chest. He could feel it in his bones, a frequency that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. The pod's fluid began to churn, the murky liquid swirling around the creature as though it was waking up, coming to life in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Creel's eyes snapped to Quinn. The lieutenant was standing rigidly, his posture tense, ready for action, but his face was a mask of confusion and fear. "This isn't just a ship, is it?" Quinn asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "No," Creel said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's something more. It's a weapon. A creation. Something we shouldn't be messing with." The alien's mouth opened, the movement slow, deliberate. Creel's heartbeat quickened. A guttural sound came from its throat, low, guttural, vibrating with the energy of something primal. "Human!" the creature rasped, its voice raw and hoarse. It took Creel a moment to process the words. The alien wasn't just speaking, it was addressing them. The sound was haunting, like something ancient, long forgotten, trying to break through the walls of time. "Do you understand?" the creature continued, its voice shaking with the strain of a language centuries old. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a ripple through the room. Creel's instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but he couldn't move. There was something about the creature's eyes, something that held him in place, something dark and powerful. "We didn't ask for this," Quinn muttered, taking a half-step back. But it was too late. The room seemed to tremble as if the ship itself had begun to wake, its pulse quickening, its heart beating once again. The walls groaned, and Creel felt the pressure rise, the weight of the ship's forgotten past closing in on them. The air crackled as the creature's words hung in the oppressive silence. Its gaze locked on Creel with an intensity that sent a shiver through his core. The ship around them seemed to pulse in response, its metal skin shuddering with the resonance of something far older than anything they could comprehend. The green symbols on the walls flickered, more erratic now, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the chamber. Creel could feel the vibrations in his teeth, a dull, grinding hum that was so deep it felt like the ship itself was alive, struggling to break free from its long slumber. Quinn moved uneasily beside him, his hand flexing around his weapon, but he didn't draw it. He was as entranced by the creature as Creel was, both men held in place by a force they couldn't name. The alien's eyes, black and endless, reflected nothing but the cold void of space, a void that now felt all too close, creeping into the very heart of the ship. The creature's voice, deep and gravelly, seemed to echo through the air, reverberating in Creel's chest. "You should not have come," it rasped, its words thick with a weight that pressed against the walls, pushing them inward. It didn't seem to speak to them directly. Instead, it was as if the words were meant for the ship itself, for the dark, forgotten past that it carried within it. The alien's body trembled beneath the fluid, as though it too was awakening after an eternity of dormancy. Creel's throat went dry, the taste of metal sharp against his tongue. His hands, still gripped tightly around his sidearm, twitched with the urge to act, but something told him that drawing his weapon would only escalate the tension. Something told him this creature, this living relic, was far beyond anything they could threaten with mere force. "What are you?" Creel's voice was low, harsh, a quiet tremor beneath his words. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the metal floor, but his body felt lighter, as though the weight of the moment was pulling him closer, as though he were being drawn into something beyond his control. The creature's lips parted in what could have been a grim smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a cruel, bitter twist. "I am a fragment," it said, its voice barely audible now, as if the ship itself was swallowing the sound. "A remnant of something greater. A failure. A lesson. For those who would dare to trespass." The words sank into Creel's chest, lodging there like a splinter of ice. His mind raced, but his body remained frozen, caught in the grip of the creature's presence. The air around him was thick now, suffused with a strange energy that hummed in his bones. The scent of decay, of centuries of isolation, clung to his skin, sharp and suffocating. It was as if the ship itself had taken on the alien's essence, the space around them thick with its history, its secrets. Quinn's breath was shallow beside him, his eyes darting nervously from Creel to the creature. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. The alien's laugh, dry and hollow, reverberated through the chamber. "You think you can understand? You think you can undo what has been done?" You are nothing but children playing with the ashes of a fire long extinguished. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows shifting and stretching as if the very walls were closing in. Creel's heart pounded in his chest, but he could feel it. This wasn't just a warning. This was a promise. They had awoken something far darker than they could imagine, and there was no going back. "We need to leave," Quinn said, his voice strained, the tremor in his tone impossible to ignore. But Creel didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the alien now, watching its every movement, every flicker of its dark, shifting gaze. The tension in the room was unbearable, pressing in on him from all sides. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truth this ship held, it was something they were not prepared for. The chamber was thick with the alien's presence, its words still hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. Creel's breath was shallow, his skin prickling as the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. The walls groaned in a low, sorrowful protest, like an ancient beast stirring from its slumber. He could feel the vibrations in his chest, like a pulse he couldn't escape, a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The air was dense, laden with the weight of long-forgotten memories. His fingers tightened around the grip of his sidearm, though he knew the weapon wouldn't do anything against whatever this was. Quinn stood beside him, his gaze flicking to the alien and back to Creel, the tension in the room thick enough to suffocate them both. "We've made a mistake," Quinn muttered, his voice a mix of fear and regret. Creel's eyes didn't leave the alien. His mind raced, trying to decipher the cryptic words, trying to understand the gravity of what they had uncovered. The creature had said they were children, but it felt like they had uncovered something far older than they could comprehend, something far darker. "What is this place?" Creel asked, his voice strained but firm. He needed answers, needed to understand why they were here and what they had just unleashed. The alien's black eyes seemed to pierce through him, cold and unblinking. It didn't answer right away, its form twitching slightly in the pod, the fluids surrounding it churning, as if it were struggling to stay still. This was the beginning," the creature rasped. "The place where it all began, where we fought and where we fell. You think you've discovered something new, something lost, but this ship carries only death." A wave of dread washed over Creel. The creature's words sank into him like ice water. He glanced at Quinn, whose face had paled, eyes wide with unease. The weight of the room seemed to press down on them, like the ship was folding in on itself, drawing them further into its depths. The alien continued, its voice rasping with centuries of bitterness. "You should leave. You should never have come. The ones who fought, they're still here, still waiting, trapped, by their own decisions, by their own arrogance." The ship seemed to vibrate with every word, as if the very walls were shuddering with the weight of those ancient memories. Creel could feel the tension tightening around him, each second stretching longer than the last. Quinn shifted uneasily, his hand tightening around his weapon. "Captain, we're not going to get any answers here. We need to leave before it's too late." Creel didn't move. His mind was racing. The alien's words, its warnings, were echoing in his skull, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something bigger, something far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. He could feel the pulse of the ship, steady and relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. "We're not leaving yet," Creel said, his voice colder than he intended. "We need to know what happened here. We need to know why this ship still exists, why it hasn't fallen to dust." The creature's laugh was low and bitter, a rasping sound that scraped against the edges of his mind. "You want to understand? Then understand this. You've awoken something that should never have been touched. You'll never leave, not once it knows you're here." Creel's blood ran cold. He turned to Quinn, but the words felt like they were becoming distant, as if they were losing their grip on reality. The shadows in the chamber seemed to deepen, the ship's pulse quickening with every second. Something was changing, something was waking, and they were about to find out what. The alien's laugh echoed through the chamber, a dry rasp that grated against the silence, its mocking tone like the scrape of metal on stone. Creel's pulse quickened, but his feet were glued to the floor, as if the ship itself had wrapped invisible chains around his legs. The air had thickened, pressing in around him, the weight of the creature's words sinking into him like stone. He could feel the walls of the chamber closing in, the ship's eerie pulse intensifying with each passing second. Quinn's voice cut through the tension, sharp and panicked. "Captain, we've overstayed our welcome. We need to get out. Now." His hand tightened around his weapon, his knuckles white. Creel didn't respond immediately, his gaze still locked on the alien figure, whose eyes seemed to gleam with a knowing malice. It wasn't fear in its gaze. It was something far worse. It was a certainty, an ancient certainty that no one could escape the ship's grip once it had decided to hold them. "Leave?" The alien's voice dripped with contempt. "You can leave all you want, human. But once you've touched this place, once you've awakened what lies within, there is no leaving. It knows you now, and it will not let you go." Creel swallowed, the metallic taste of fear clinging to his tongue. The air felt heavier now, each breath harder to take. The creature's words had a weight to them, a truth buried deep within the ship's cold, rusting bones. He could almost hear the ship itself sighing, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for them to stumble into its grasp. The darkness of the chamber seemed to stretch out, swallowing the light, distorting everything in its path. Quinn's hand gripped Creel's arm, a silent plea for action, but Creel stood rooted, as though his feet had become one with the floor. The smell of metal, dust, and something faintly decayed filled the air, sharp and tangy, stinging his nostrils. The alien's eyes never left him, the blackness of them pulling him in, dragging him deeper into its ancient, hidden knowledge. It wasn't just the ship that was alive. It was everything around them. The walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. The walls around them groaned, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through the soles of their boots. It was as though the ship was stretching, expanding, awakening from a long, dark slumber. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the chamber, and Creel's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. Something was coming. "Tell me what happened here," Creel demanded, his voice barely louder than a whisper, but the weight behind the words was undeniable. "What did you do?" The alien's lips curled into a grin that was anything but comforting. "We made a mistake," it said, its voice low and ragged, dripping with centuries of regret. "We thought we could control it. But it was always bigger than us. The war, the consequences, the price. We were nothing but tools, just like you." Creel's stomach turned at the implications, but the creature's words were like poison, seeping into his thoughts. The ship was more than a vessel. It was a prison, a tomb, and a weapon all rolled into one. The truth was here, buried beneath layers of deception and fear, and it was far worse than he had imagined. "What is it?" Quinn's voice broke through Creel's thoughts, desperation in every syllable. "What are we dealing with?" The creature's grin widened, and for a moment the chamber felt like it was closing in entirely, the darkness suffocating them both. "It," the alien rasped, its voice growing quieter, "is watching you. It's always watching." Creel's eyes flicked to Quinn. They were running out of time. Creel's gaze darted from the alien's dark, unblinking eyes to the strange symbols glowing faintly along the chamber's walls. The air felt thick with something ancient, like a warning that had been waiting for centuries to be heard. The ship's pulse reverberated through the floor, a low, constant throb that seemed to vibrate in his chest. His hands clenched at his sides, the metallic tang of fear sharp in his mouth. The creature's words, the cold certainty in its voice, were gnawing at him, digging deeper into his thoughts, like something trying to tear through his mind. "You think you can escape this?" the alien rasped, its grin widening, showing rows of teeth that were far too sharp. The faint light from the walls flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, their shapes warping and twisting like the memories of something forgotten. Creel's skin prickled under the weight of the alien's gaze. "It sees you, all of you. It has always seen you." Behind him, Quinn shifted nervously, his hand twitching toward his weapon, but Creel didn't move. The air around them was becoming suffocating, heavy with a presence that didn't belong. The cold seemed to press against his chest, stealing the warmth from his body, and with every breath, the metallic taste of fear grew stronger in his throat. The alien's laughter echoed again, deep and unsettling, vibrating through the room. "You cannot outrun it. You cannot fight it. You are no different from the others, the ones who came before you." Creel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, the strange symbols glowing faintly, but there was no clear direction. The ship felt alive now, alive in a way that wasn't natural, as though it was aware of their presence, aware of their every move. The shadows seemed to be closing in on them, pressing tighter with each passing second. "Tell us what happened," Creel said, his voice low and steady, though the tension in his chest was nearly unbearable. He needed answers. There was no choice now. Whatever was happening, whatever they had awoken, they needed to understand it before it consumed them. The creature's smile faltered, a fleeting moment of something deeper flashing in its eyes, something almost human. "We thought we were saving ourselves," it murmured, its voice quieter now, the cold bitterness replaced by something darker, something tragic. "But we were wrong. It was never about survival. It was always about control." Creel's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. "Control of what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien's lips twisted, a laugh that was hollow and sad. "Control of everything," it said, its tone heavy with regret. "We unleashed it. And now it is here, waiting. It will never let you leave." Creel's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to blur. The temperature plummeted again, the chill now seeping into his very bones. The walls began to groan, and the ship trembled beneath them, as if something inside it was stirring, something powerful, something dark. Quinn took a step back, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "We need to get out. Now, Captain, before it's too late." "Captain!" Quinn's voice broke through the cacophony, his words tight, urgent. "This place is alive. We can't fight it, not like this." Creel didn't answer at first. His eyes swept across the chamber, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The alien's cryptic warnings echoed in his ears, and the ship seemed to be reacting, responding to something deep within it, something hidden. He could almost taste the fear on the back of his tongue, metallic and cold, mixing with the stale air. His heart beat louder in his chest, a rapid drum that almost drowned out the ship's violent tremors. He clenched his jaw and steeled himself. "We're not leaving until we understand what's happening here," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't just run. We need to find the source of this." Quinn's eyes were wide, his breath shallow, but he didn't argue. His fingers twitched around the grip of his weapon, but it was clear that their guns were little more than symbols of defiance against something far bigger, far darker. The air around them seemed to crackle with the presence of whatever force was awakening deep within the ship's belly. A cold, unsettling sensation crawled across Creel's skin. The ship, with its walls of steel and decaying metal, felt as if it were breathing, expanding and contracting with each passing moment, as though it had never truly been dormant. Without warning, the ship's lights flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows across the chamber. For a brief, terrifying instant, the shadows on the walls seemed to move, as if something was crawling just out of sight. The temperature dropped again, and Creel could see his breath in the air, the mist curling in front of him like ghosts. He clenched his fists at his sides, forcing his feet to stay grounded despite the urge to flee. Then came a sudden sound, a mechanical, metallic shriek that sliced through the air, vibrating the walls around them. It was the sound of something powerful, something ancient, awakening from deep within the ship's core. Creel's heart skipped, and the sound was almost unbearable. A terrible realization settled in his chest. The ship wasn't just reacting to them, it was responding to something far worse, something buried beneath its layers of forgotten history. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a weapon, a cage, and its purpose was far more than anyone had anticipated. "The core," Creel muttered, his voice rough, almost drowned out by the noise. "It's all connected. The source of this, It's in the core. Then let's go, Quinn said, his voice a low growl, his hand shaking but determined. Before it's too late. Creel nodded sharply, his eyes locking with Quinn's. They didn't have time for hesitation anymore. The air around them buzzed with a palpable tension, the ship seemingly alive with an intent that could not be ignored. Whatever they were about to face, it wasn't just a relic from the past. It was something more, something dangerous. And they were walking straight into its grip. The ship's tremors intensified as Creel and Quinn pressed forward, the oppressive air pressing in around them like a vice. The walls seemed to shift and groan, their metallic surfaces creaking as if the very structure was alive, writhing with the force of something hidden deep within. Creel's thoughts raced, his mind churning with the realization that they had crossed a line, one that had sealed their fate. The alien's words echoed in his head, the warning still hanging in the air, a promise that they wouldn't leave unscathed. The ship, this vessel, was not just a machine. It was a prison, a weapon, a monster, and it had been waiting. "Captain," Quinn's voice was tight, edged with the anxiety that had taken root in them both. "We need to find a way to stop this before it escalates further. This ship, it's not just broken, it's aware of us." Creel didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the flickering lights above them, the steady pulse of the ship's walls vibrating beneath his boots. The temperature had dropped so low that every breath felt like inhaling ice. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of something long forgotten and left to rot. Creel knew they had little time before whatever force had been locked away deep inside this ship would come fully awake. "We move toward the core," Creel said, his voice cutting through the growing unease. "Whatever's in there is controlling this. We destroy it, and we stop whatever this ship is about to do." Quinn nodded, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his eyes. "And how do we destroy it? We've seen what it can do already. This ship isn't a simple relic. It's a weapon." "We won't destroy it with force," Creel said, his mind working as he sized up the dimly lit corridor ahead. "We need to disrupt its systems. If we can reach the central control room, we can override the ship's command. We'll need to shut down the power core first, then access the mainframe." Quinn grimaced. "And how do you propose we do that?" Creel looked at him, the weight of the situation pressing on his shoulders. "We'll have to create a diversion. The power conduits are linked to the core, so we can overload one of them. It'll trigger a short circuit, disrupt the ship's systems long enough for us to access the core's shutdown mechanism." Quinn's eyes narrowed. "It's risky." "It's our only option," Creel said. "If we don't, this ship will become a tomb for us both. We're walking on a knife's edge." The plan was simple in theory, but Creel knew the risks. If they triggered a failure in the power system, they would have seconds, maybe less, to get to the core and shut it down. There was no room for error. He looked around, his mind piecing together the ship's layout from their limited intel. The power conduits ran along the main corridors, connecting the control room to the heart of the ship. Their first target was the secondary conduit junction, a place that wasn't heavily guarded by the ship's automated systems. Creel's fingers twitched around the handle of his sidearm, but his eyes never wavered from the task at hand. "Let's move," he said, his voice steady, determined. They began their march, each step deliberate, each move calculated, the weight of the plan hanging over them like a storm ready to break. As they moved deeper into the heart of the ship, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, deeper. Creel could almost feel the ship's pulse beneath his feet, the steady, rhythmic beat growing stronger, like the countdown to an inevitable explosion. They had to move faster. They had to make it to the core before the ship decided to seal their fate. The corridors stretched endlessly ahead, each step deeper into the ship's bowels, heightening the pressure building in Creel's chest. Every footfall was muffled, as though the air itself had become heavier, thickened by the ship's oppressive presence. The walls seemed to close in around them, their cold surfaces slick with condensation, the faint metallic scent of decay still lingering, pungent and sharp. Each breath he took was labored, cold and sharp against the back of his throat, a reminder that the temperature had dropped so much it was almost unbearable. The ship groaned again, the sound reverberating through the floor like a warning. "We need to get to the junction first," Creel said, his voice steady, though he could feel the urgency creeping into his words. He glanced at Quinn, whose eyes were darting around, looking for signs of movement, his hand never far from his weapon. They had no time to waste. "If we don't trigger the short circuit in the power conduit, everything we've done so far will be for nothing." Quinn nodded, swallowing hard as he followed. The tightness in his expression was evident, but Creel could see the resolve behind it. Despite the fear gnawing at them both, they moved with purpose. Each corridor they passed felt increasingly claustrophobic, as though the ship were breathing with them, its walls pulsing as they ventured further into its depths. They reached the junction, a small, tight space where the power conduits intersected, a network of pipes and wires snaking along the walls. The air felt colder here, and the faint scent of burnt plastic mixed with the lingering stench of mold. Creel stopped in front of a terminal, his fingers flying over the console, accessing the power grid. Quinn stood guard, his eyes scanning the darkness, alert for any signs of movement. "Here," Creel muttered, as a map of the power system flashed onto the screen. He traced his finger along the conduit's path. "We trigger this conduit here, overload the system. It'll cause a power surge, but it'll give us enough time to reach the core. The short circuit will disrupt the entire system for about 30 seconds. That's all we need." Quinn clenched his jaw but didn't speak. They both knew the risks. They didn't have 30 seconds. The ship's pulse was quickening, almost frantic, as if it sensed their presence, their intent. Creel accessed the override. The ship responded immediately, the lights flickering, then plunging them into a deeper darkness. Quinn's breath caught as the entire junction shuddered, the vibrations from the ship's power system shaking them both. "It's done," Creel said, his voice firm, though his pulse hammered in his ears. The ship's groan was louder now, almost angry, the walls vibrating with an intensity that made Creel's teeth ache. "Now we move," Quinn snapped. His voice was taut with the realization that their time was running out. They sprinted down the corridor, the walls closing in even more as the ship seemed to constrict around them. Creel's heart raced, the weight of the plan pressing down on him. His eyes flicked to the flickering lights, and he knew, he could feel it in his bones, that the ship was about to retaliate. They had triggered something far beyond their control, and there would be no turning back now. The ship was waking up, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. "Hold on," Creel said, his breath coming in short bursts. "We've only got one shot at this." The ship's pulse was a deafening roar now, an unrelenting thrum that vibrated through Creel's bones, the walls themselves shaking as if alive, desperate to keep them from reaching the core. The darkness ahead deepened, consuming everything, but Creel's focus never wavered. The plan was in motion. Their window was closing. Every moment felt like a countdown, the ship's heartbeat quickening in tandem with his own. He could feel Quinn's presence beside him, tense and watchful, but neither of them slowed, not even as the corridors seemed to narrow with every step. "We're almost there," Creel said, his voice low but unwavering, like steel being drawn from the forge. His hand clenched around the weapon at his side, fingers itching. There was no more time for hesitation. They had set the wheels in motion. Now they would see it through. There was no going back. The lights above them flickered one last time before plunging them into darkness, but Creel didn't flinch. He knew what lay ahead. The ship was alive now, fully awake, but it hadn't anticipated what humanity could do. The darkness that had suffocated them, the fear that had crept into their hearts, was now fuel for the fire that burned in Creel's chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. They had become the unstoppable force the ship had never predicted, the very thing it was designed to contain. "You said it was watching us," Quinn whispered, his voice tight, almost fearful. "But it doesn't know us. Not really. It doesn't know what we're capable of." "No, it doesn't," Creel said, his words heavy with finality. "It never understood. We're not just survivors. We're conquerors. We always have been." The ground beneath them trembled as they rounded the final corner, the heart of the ship looming before them, a pulsing mass of energy and chaos. The power conduits flickered wildly, an unnatural hum building from deep within the core. Creel knew that by now the ship was fully aware of their presence, aware of the damage they'd caused. But it didn't matter. Their plan had been set in motion. The disruption had already begun. It was too late to stop them. "Get ready," Creel said, his voice hard, his heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the thrumming pulse of the ship. He could feel Quinn's tension, the weight of their actions pressing down on them both. But there was no room for doubt now. They had come this far. They moved toward the core, the light from the conduits illuminating their path. Each step echoed in the silence of the ship, a steady drumbeat that reverberated in Creel's chest. The walls seemed to breathe with them, the shadows moving like sentinels, watching their every move. The power was still surging, but it would be short-lived. Creel knew that they had already tipped the scales. The ship had never expected humanity to be this dangerous, this relentless. "We'll finish this now," Creel said, the words more a promise than a command. He stood tall, unyielding, eyes locked on the heart of the beast. It's time to end what was started. And then, with a final purposeful movement, Creel triggered the last sequence. The lights flickered one final time, and for a moment, everything stood still. Then the ship screamed. But it wasn't the ship's voice that rang through the corridors. It was the unmistakable sound of victory, the sound of humanity, not just surviving, but claiming its place in the stars. "We did it," Quinn whispered, awe and disbelief mixed in his tone. "We're not just survivors," Creel said, his voice unwavering. "We're the ones they fear. We always have been." The ship trembled one last time, a violent shudder that felt like the death rattle of a creature caught in its final moments. The power surged, flickering across the darkened hallways like dying stars, the last remnants of the ship's existence burning out in a chaotic, erratic pulse. Creel stood at the center of it, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths, eyes scanning the core as its lights began to dim, the system breaking down piece by piece. The final sequence had been triggered. There was no turning back now. They had done it. The ship was collapsing. It was over. Quinn was next to him, the tension still in his stance, but his face held the faintest flicker of something close to relief. The walls around them groaned, the metal scraping against itself in protest. But Creel didn't flinch. They had won. The last pulse of the ship's energy flickered weakly before dissipating, and for a moment, an eerie silence filled the chamber. It was a silence unlike any they had experienced before. No vibrations, no growl of the ship's pulse. Just stillness. "We've taken it down," Creel murmured, his voice steady, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle. It was a truth that seemed almost impossible, yet undeniable. This was the moment when humanity, the species that had once been considered weak and fragile, had not only survived, but triumphed. Quinn, eyes wide with disbelief, took a step back, his voice catching in his throat. "It's over?" His question seemed to hang in the air, a fragile hope, a tentative disbelief. "Yes," Creel said, his voice sharp with finality. "We've beaten it. We did what no one else could. This ship, this weapon, it was made to contain us. But it underestimated us. We were never just survivors. We were always destined to become something more." Quinn didn't speak, but the quiet nod of his head said it all. They were standing in the aftermath. But this wasn't a defeat. This was a victory. Humanity had reached the edge of the galaxy, faced the unknown, and come out stronger for it. Creel turned his eyes to the flickering lights, the last remnants of the ship's control system stuttering in the final moments before it was gone. For a long moment, they stood there, side by side, in the heart of the broken vessel, the silence enveloping them like a cloak. The ship had been the last of its kind, a weapon built to control, to contain, to suppress. But it was in that final, desperate struggle that Creel understood something profound. The aliens who had created this ship had feared humanity's potential. They had feared what they couldn't control, and now they had learned why. "We weren't meant to be controlled," Creel said, more to himself than anyone else, his voice quiet but resolute. "We were meant to conquer." Quinn met his gaze, the same understanding flashing in his eyes. The humans know something they don't. And just like that, the truth settled in, the weight of it pressing down on them like the endless stars outside the broken ship's walls. Humanity wasn't just a survivor in the galaxy. It was a force. It was a power that could not be contained, could not be subjugated, and it had just begun to show the universe exactly what it was capable of. The ship was dead, but their journey, humanity's journey, was only beginning. Creel looked out into the vastness of space, the unknown stretching out before them. With a final breath, he spoke the words that solidified their victory. Let them know. The humans have arrived.